I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is New Brunswick author of the book Rise, a devotion to whole grains. Please welcome Jess Ross. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Jess.
Thanks for having me, Vic.
Let's talk a little bit about what led to this book. How did you get to a point of producing not only a cookbook, but a devotion to something you love so much?
Well, I've been baking. My bakery is turning 15 next month, so I've been doing this since I was 23, and have put a lot of my life into learning and baking and learning about grains, and I've had an amazing set of teachers who've taught me all kinds of amazing techniques and amazing lessons that are applicable to life. So I am kind of in a career transition, and I really wanted to write a book that put into words and pictures and instructions a lot of the things that I've learned, and also celebrate the recipes that I love. So a lot of the recipes in the book feature Charlotte County specialties.
I know, I should say this is my cousin Jess Ross, who's now based in Nova Scotia. But talk a little bit about where your bakery is, but how you're tied to this part of the world as well.
Yeah, my bakery is about an hour outside of Halifax on an old farm property, and it's a little wood-fired oven bakery that's inside a shipping container that I built about just over 10 years ago. And I found myself in Halifax. I went there for university after high school. I grew up in Quispamsis, but both my grandparents and my parents are from Charlotte County. My dad's from St. Andrews, and my mom grew up in Blacks. And I spent a ton of my childhood in Penfield on the Ridge, in my grandmother's kitchen, following her and doing a little bit of baking with her, although she was a bit of a control freak, so I didn't do much. But I was watching and obviously tasting and learning through her and some of my other aunts just about how to bake. And that really got me into food. And so in university, I worked for a catering company. And when I was done school, I really wanted to travel. So I went to Germany for a year and basically volunteered for 6-day-a-week work weeks at 2 different bakeries, which I write a lot about in the book. So it's a lot, there's a lot of stories in the book. Half the stories are about my baking teachers in my adult years, and then half the stories are about the role of my aunts and my grandma in how they taught me and shaped me and gave me an appreciation for baking.
I know, I feel like I'm going to learn so much about my cousin because I was at your book launch here in Charlotte County at the Ganong Chocolatier, which was so cool to see, but I haven't had a chance to fully delve into your book yet. So I feel like I'm going to learn so much about you.
It's an overshare.
Along the way.
It's an overshare.
But what is it about the whole grain? Can we talk a little bit about that made you so devoted to it?
Yeah, well, when I went to Germany, Germans love bread. And they love bread of all kinds. You might think of Europeans or Northern Europeans as really being into rye bread. And I was really interested in rye bread, which was one of the reasons why I went to Germany. But when I got there, it was oh, they're actually masters at baking all different kinds of bread. And I worked in 2 different bakeries, and they made 40 to 50 kinds of bread, including baguette and Italian bread, but also these really interesting kinds of breads that were made with local whole grains like rye, but also oats and wheat, barley, spelt, buckwheat. I was just exposed to a whole new world of grains, and they were not like the white flour I was used to, but they were just interesting. And a lot of them came from farms that were nearby, so they were locally grown, coarse grains, and the bread recipes that they make there were really suited to those kinds of flours. So I got to know those recipes, and I was doing a practicum essentially, so I didn't get paid, but the second bakery I worked at was we want to let you photocopy our whole recipe book as a thank you. And so, or you can take any recipes. So on one of my last days, I went to the farm bakery photocopier scanner and I scanned a whole bunch of recipes. So when I got back, I just started baking, and I started my own business. I was 23. It was a bit impulsive, to be honest. But it really took, and people were really interested in this kind of bread. I made rye breads and I made whole wheat breads, a little bit with kamut, which is an ancient wheat variety. And I was just dabbling and learning a lot. And there was a really influential summer where I paired up with a baker who was working with Spearville, who was kind of going around. He was a sales rep for Spearville, but had his own bakery, his own whole grain bakery. So he really showed me that I could get similar grains that I found in Germany that were grown in the Maritimes, milled in New Brunswick, And I started learning about Spearville, and I also went to the Kneading Conference, which is an artisan baking conference that happens in Skowhegan. And Doug took me, he was presenting, and I went there with him and as his guest, and I got to do all these workshops that were all about working with local grains. And I realized that in the Northeast, in North America, including New Brunswick and a little bit Nova Scotia, there was this movement of local grain growers and bakers who were committed to working with local grains. So I was really hooked, because for me, I just have always been interested in local food and local food culture, and the fact that I could bring that together with baking was amazing.
So Spearville, for people who don't know, tell us a little bit more about it and what they make.
Yeah, like Spearville's it's like a 30 or 40-year-old company. It started as a co-op, like with some farmers who were growing things and putting them together, but it evolved and became more focused on grain. And then I don't know if it was in the 90s or in the early 2000s, but it changed ownership and became like more committedly like a whole grain mill. So, and they wanted to mill grain that was grown in the Maritimes. So part of the work that they did was go out to farmers who had they had the equipment for growing grain, but they were only growing grain for animal feed, not for bread, because there wasn't really a market for bread grain, like in New Brunswick, in PEI. And they worked with farmers and helped farmers, and farmers did a lot of learning to like rebuild the skill of actually how to grow grain for food and bread, because it's different. There's different kinds of conditions you have to look for. The harvesting has to be more precise, because if you get the harvesting off and the growing off, then it actually shows up in the bread, and the bread can be too difficult. The flour can be too hard to work with. So it's a whole interesting skill set that was almost totally lost because people just weren't growing grain to eat anymore in the Maritimes. So Spearville is really important. From my perspective, they're very important to just local food security in the Maritimes, because without them, there wouldn't be the same number of farmers who even have the knowledge to grow grain. So.
Wow, I'm actually like so excited to check them out and learn more about them just from talking to you about it. Has there been I feel like there is this renaissance, resurgence in the love of bread, and I don't know if maybe COVID had partly to do with that when we were all at home, but there was a time when I think people were more afraid of bread, and that could have been a Hollywood Atkins movement, but we seem to have like refound a love affair and are finding that it's better for this than we maybe understood.
Yeah, well, bread is a part of our culture and our society. It's quite ancient and old, and grains are, I'm a food nerd and a food history nerd, so there's actually a lot of food history in the book, including Charlotte County food history, but also the history of grains, because these grains that we work with, like wheat, they've been around for close to 10,000 years, and grain growing and grain farming was actually a part of the way that humans transitioned from being like nomadic peoples that moved around to people that were able to be settled in one place and grow food that could be stored, dried year round. So bread, when you like really understand the history of humanity, like in a long-term sense, bread is a very important part of the story, and I find it sad and kind of interesting and curious that bread's also kind of hated in contemporary diet culture. And you're right, like there is a resurgence, but still like every 5 years there's like a new diet that hates bread, like the keto, or like, just their kind of anti-carb stuff. So anyway, I won't go on about that, even though I could, but yeah, you're right, like sourdough is like, having a sourdough is a little bit like having a pet. So I think part of the reason why a very low maintenance pet, part of the reason why people were interested in the pandemic was like boredom, but also it's like something that you kind of have to nurture and care for, but it's also pretty easy. And it's really satisfying to like see something transform, because it is like an interesting transformation when you take like a dry powder and then you turn it into like a beautiful loaf of bread.
Can you talk a little bit about the book and how you decided to divide the chapters? Yeah, so for me, this book it's a manual for like how to work with whole grains, because we're really used to working with white flour, and it's challenging. Like there are different kinds of rules, I guess. Some of the rules for making white bread and whole grain bread are the same, and then some are different. And the same if you're making cookies with white flour or cakes or with whole grains. But there are like some special things to know, and I just spent my career really doing a ton of trial and error and learning a lot of hard lessons about what works and what doesn't work. So for me, I wanted to create something that helped people feel more comfortable working with whole grains, and not just whole wheat flour, but other grains. So the book features 7 different grains: oats, corn, kamut, spelt, buckwheat, rye,
and one other one that I can't remember. But so it's part of it is separated into sections where each grain has a little collection of recipes that kind of show you some of the best ways to work with that particular grain. So there's a couple gluten-free. It's not a gluten-free cookbook, but there are some gluten-free recipes, and there are some tips and tricks for working with corn and buckwheat, which are gluten-free grains. And then the last part of the book, which is the more sentimental part, although it's all fairly sentimental because I'm a sap. But it's 6 short stories that are all about the influence of my grandmother and my aunts growing up. And specifically like little vignettes and little moments that really impacted me, and some like little snippets of Charlotte County history. Like for instance, there's a little story that I tell. My grandmother always made doughboys. There's a doughboy recipe in here, like a fried bread dough. And I made a whole wheat and dulse. It's called dulse doughboys, the recipe in here. So it's actually a whole wheat doughboy recipe. But my grandmother every summer, like she made doughboys all the time. She grew up on doughboys. And molasses, but she would go to the Blacks Harbor County Fair every fall, like the Labor Day fair that Connors used to put on, and she would be in the booth like making doughboys, and we would just be like eating the doughboys. And I have like really just like beautiful memories of the fun of that fair as a kid, and just like celebrating workers. Like, I mean, it was a Labor Day celebration,
like a fog festival type.
Blacks
Harbor.
Yeah, and it was like put on by the company, and it was like for the workers, and there were so many people in my family that worked for Connors that we got our like passes. And but like there's moments where like these recipes it's a fair, it was a cultural event, but like the cultural food and like the Charlotte County recipes are like a part of that event and that history. So the book was an opportunity for me to also do a little bit of sharing about that, because when I first started working on the book, my grandmother was alive and she passed away. Her name is Jean Ann Stevens, née McGilvery, and she's from Shamcook, and like grew up mostly in Blacks after age 12, and then lived on the Ridge for a while until she moved to St. John, closer to us. But I lost my train of thought.
You have brought with you her, which I think from like a Charlotte, this is like a Bible, I would say.
Thank you.
In Charlotte County, which I'd love for you to show people at home. I'll get you to hold it, because you've got recipes in here that come from the courier, that come from your grandma, things that she has saved. Yeah, so the book was always going to have some of my grandmother's recipes in it because they're my favorite baking recipes. But when she passed away, I had already started working on the book, and I knew I wanted some of her recipes to be in it. But then I realized, like, for me, I wanted the book to in part be like a tribute to her and a way to like memorialize her, and also like my life experiences that I had here, because I've lived away from Charlotte County for decades now, but it really like holds a pretty strong place in my heart. I try to come back every year. And I inherited her recipe books. I don't know why any of my other cousins didn't want them, or if they did, but she left them to me. And this one, there were many books, but this was her like special collection where she would write out all of the recipes. So for this project, I went through this entire book and cataloged every recipe title. And she was a real history buff and also really good, a kind of natural archivist. So all of the recipes, she would record who the author was, like who she got the recipe from. So I also recorded all the names of all the authors of the recipes, just in a document for me to have, and just so that it would be written down. And so, yeah, I guess like I am a food history buff, as I said. But yeah, like I love archives, and I love like just different I think recipes are in and of themselves, they're kind of story archives. Like recipes have lineages, they evolve, they often come from places far away. Like in the oat section, I have like a Nova Scotia Maritime oat cake, but then I also have like a traditional Scottish oat cake, which is a bit different. But the Maritime version is basically an adaptation of that recipe that would have come over like from people from Scotland who came to Canada to live. And so my grandmother was a big history buff, so I guess she rubbed off on me in that way. And she had other cookbooks, but this is just like a really amazing archive of Charlotte County recipe history. And so I wanted to celebrate that. And that's what I did in my book. Oh, it's so beautiful. And it really does. It is such a reminder that, I mean, I always love the expression that you are what you eat, but like you said, it is such a huge part of who we are in our history is the food we make and how we choose to serve it.
For sure.
So it's really special.
And a lot of women's knowledge in particular gets kind of recorded in histories. Like a lot of like history books were written by men where women were like often working in the domestic sphere, and the way that their knowledge was recorded is not necessarily the same, but from my perspective, a lot of women's knowledge is recorded in recipes.
And I love that she's got like the dates from the courier.
Yeah, this recipe is in the book. I made so I'm a whole grain baker. The book is called A Devotion to Whole Grains. My grandmother did work a little bit with whole grains, but most of these recipes are white flour recipes, and I love white flour. I'm not a hater of white flour, but I do love working with whole grains. So I took 10 of her recipes and made whole grain adaptations of them for the book, including this award-winning old-fashioned oatmeal raisin cookie recipe that was published in the Courier in 2006 that she had recorded. So it's a simple modification to take this recipe from white flour to whole grains, but it's already got oats in it, which are whole grains. So I just went the distance and made it a 100% whole grain recipe. So it's originally was a white flour and oats, and then I made a whole wheat and oat version.
What is that feeling to like, I feel like to author a book is so many people's goal that most people never realize because it is such a huge undertaking. Yeah. But then to also author a recipe, it's two different forms of being an author, really. How does it feel to have this accomplishment, not just writing a history of your love of the whole grain, but also to create a new way to make food with it?
It's more serious than I thought when I was like, I'll write a cookbook. Like I have all these recipes, like I've got notebooks, and like I have a bakery, so some of those recipes are modifications of other people's recipes. Some of them I invented from scratch. But certainly the pressure of writing them for a book is a bit different because other people are going to be making these recipes at home, and ideally people will have success. So it was a big learning curve for me to get recipes as good as I possibly could, get them tested, have people using different ingredients. One thing about white flour is that it's very standardized, and it's very similar from one batch to another, from one year to another, from one brand to another. But whole grain flours are very unique. They really reflect sometimes just like the conditions of the weather. They reflect the conditions of the land where they came from. They really kind of are unique, each one. So it's a challenge to write a book that allows people to use recipes with using very different ingredients. Like a whole wheat flour here could be very different than a whole wheat flour that comes from Ontario or England, and it gets very specific.
And it's a beautiful book as well, which from a cookbook standpoint, I know what a challenge it is to put together something that has so many incredible visuals for people who are at home right now and are interested in buying it. I know it's available at Indigo Chapters. You can order it online. Is that the easiest
it's available
way
where books are sold. There are copies at Ganong's.
Okay.
I like to try and promote small business as much as possible. There is a site, Indie Reads, that will kind of direct you to small bookstores that carry any book that's published in Canada. But yeah, you can find it around, and it'll be at Ganong's. The reason why I paired or wanted to work with Ganong's is that there's a gumdrop cake recipe in the book. And Ganong's makes really beautiful gumdrops, which I think are better than the Bulk Barn ones. They're a beautiful color, and they're really interesting flavors. And these, to be honest, are the Bulk Barn ones because Ganong's hasn't yet made their Christmas run of the Ganong's gums, but I've been told that they're going to happen soon. And if you need to go to Ganong's to get gumdrops for your Christmas baking, you can also pick up a copy of the book.
I got to have this at your book launch and our family Thanksgiving, so
so this one,
I might get to keep some of this later.
This one is a corn flour gumdrop cake, so this is a gluten-free gumdrop cake, and it's quite delicious.
Do you have your favorite recipe, or do you find it therapeutic when you are baking? And do you have a go-to that is your personal favorite? Or is that giving away too much?
No, it's not. I mean, the soft molasses cookie recipe in the book, like when my grandmother died, I made soft molasses cookies the same day.
Right. Yeah.
Like I was just like, I don't know, for me it wasn't hugely surprising the day that she passed. She was trending downward. But still, it was just like something I did to cope. And one of the chapters in the book is actually a story about her funeral, because my cousins and we all actually kind of showed up to the wake with versions of her recipes to share with people. And so many of the stories that came about when when we were talking with family at the funeral and at the wake were just about the memories people had of stopping by Jean's kitchen and and having baked goods, because she would wake up at 4 and often bake something like every day. And she had a lot of traffic, so she could sustain the production in her own kitchen. Like, people would just stop by. So that's a favorite. Like I said, I went to Germany because I was really curious about rye bread. Rye is a really interesting grain. A lot of people don't like rye flour. It tends to make kind of more sour bread. It has a strong flavor, but I just found it, I was quite captured by it and found it always kind of romantic. And it is like a Northern European grain. But in doing research for this book, I learned, like, when settlers first came here, the land wasn't very suitable for growing wheat. Like, wheat has higher, it needs more. It has more difficult, it's more difficult to grow, and rye is actually something that always has thrived when there's been droughts and when there's been too much water. And so at different points in history, rye flour has been really important to sustaining human communities, and not just in Northern Europe, but actually, like, when settlers were first here, rye was a very popular grain that, like, helped sustain early communities. And so it's got a cool story, but I also think it's really delicious. So there's a 100% rye bread recipe in there, because a lot of people who are interested in rye try to make 100% rye breads and they struggle, because it is a really different kind of dough, totally different texture, different chemistry. And I think I make a really amazing rye bread, to be honest. I've made many. I've primarily been the only baker in my bakery. It's very small. It's called Gold Island Bakery, based in Nova Scotia, but I've made over 100,000 loaves of bread, by myself over the last 13 years. And so I've done it a lot. I've learned a lot, and I definitely have that one down. So that's actually the bread that's on the cover, and I would say that's maybe also a special recipe in the book. And in general, whole grain sourdough is kind of a unique sourdough, like I mentioned before. So the book is also very specifically, there's a lot of recipes and techniques specifically around sourdough bread making. So if you're interested in sourdough, even if you want to make white sourdough, there's a lot of good knowledge in there.
I'm so excited, because the way you worded is so beautiful. Is that connection to, it's the connection to your family, it's the connection to the geography of where you live, but it's a connection to human history. Every time you pick up something and decide to cook, is that a feeling that you carry with you every day throughout your job?
Yeah, bread is life. I love taking, another thing, a theme that comes up in the book is, like, I have a nurturing nature, I would say, and I love feeding people, and I find it really satisfying, and I really got that from my grandmother. And so for me, even having a bakery, and I did a lot of farmers marketing, like most of the bread I sold directly to customers, so I have long relationships with some of my customers. I've directly put the loaves I've made into their hands, and I just like, knowing that I'm helping people have, like, a well-nourished day and bringing some pleasure and joy to their life. So for me, that's an important part of the work, and why I think I did it for so long. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What does it feel like to have it out in the world for people's consumption, not just your food now, but now a book that represents so much of who you are?
It's a mix. It's a lot of, like, relief. It was a lot of work. It took me 5 years to make, and it was challenging. It was the hardest. I've worked on some big projects. Like, I started a business, I built a shipping container bakery, but this book was a very unique challenge, and it was hard. So I'm happy that it's done and it's out. I get nervous. I want people to find success in the recipes. It's kind of a vulnerability, I guess, to have it out. It's also a lot of, you can really get to know me pretty well from the stories in the book, so there's that element. But I'm happy it's out, and like I mentioned, I'm working in environmental education now. I went and got an environmental education degree and focused on food education, and I wrote the first draft of this book when I was in grad school. And it's an educational tool. So I'm doing similar food work, but different. And this is really nice to have this as, like, kind of a way to celebrate the career and all the work that I did over that 15 years. It's nice. It's kind of like it's nice. I feel like I'm closing a chapter, and it's really amazing to have my stories and recipes available that people can keep going on their own. Yeah.
Well, since I am your least skilled cousin in the kitchen, next time you are in Charlotte County, I'd love to have you back on our show, Good Day from the Bay. I'm going to practice.
Okay.
I'm going to practice, but maybe we can cook something together next time you're in town.
I would love that.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. I can't wait to read it, Jess. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
My guest today has been Jess Ross, author of Rise, a devotion to whole grains. I'm Vicky Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.